It was one of those nights when the city felt like it was holding its breath. The streets of Indianapolis stretched silent under the dull glow of scattered streetlights, buildings casting long shadows into the empty avenues. Inside his patrol car, Officer Daniel Brooks adjusted the rearview mirror and glanced at his partner, Max. A seasoned German Shepherd K9 with ears perked and eyes sharp. The two had patrolled countless nights together, but there was something oddly heavy in the stillness tonight. No major incidents had been reported over the radio, just the usual static and the occasional routine call. Still, Daniel couldn't shake the sense that something was off. He rolled down the window slightly, letting in the crisp Indiana air. The hum of the city was unusually faint, as if it, too, was waiting for something to happen. Max sat motionless, his body tense yet composed, scanning the sidewalks and intersections with a quiet alertness. Daniel had long since learned to trust his partner's instincts. Max's senses often picked up on things long before any human could. Then, as they cruised slowly past an empty playground, Max suddenly sat up straighter, his ears twitching. Daniel caught th. Daniel eased his foot off the gas, bringing the patrol car to a slow crawl. Max's growl deepened, his body leaning slightly forward toward the windshield. Daniel's eyes followed his partner's gaze, and there it was. Parked on the side of the road, just past the edge of the playground, was a dark-colored SUV. Its headlights were off, windows slightly fogged. Nothing about it screamed trouble at first glance, but Max had gone rigid now, eyes locked on the vehicle. Daniel parked a short distance behind it, his fingers tapping once against the steering wheel before grabbing his flashlight. He looked at Max. "Let's check it out, boy." Max let out a soft, guttural bark, confirmation enough. As they stepped into the chilly night, the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath Daniel's boots and the faint jingle of Max's collar. They approached the SUV with practiced caution, Daniel's flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The driver's silhouette was barely visible. Then, as the light swept across the back seat, Daniel's breath caught. A small figure, bundled in blankets, lay motionless. A baby. Instinct took over. Max moved closer to the vehicle, his stance protective, his growl turning urgent. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And as Daniel reached for the driver's side window, a chill crept down his spine. Whatever was happening in that SUV was about to change everything. Officer Daniel Brooks approached the SUV cautiously, flashlight in one hand, the other resting near his holstered sidearm. Max stayed close, his growl low and steady, eyes never leaving the rear seat. Daniel stopped a few feet from the driver's side window and tapped it twice with the end of his flashlight. The man inside flinched, then slowly rolled the window down just enough to reveal a gaunt face soaked in sweat. His hair was unkempt, eyes darting between Daniel and Max with jittery desperation. "Evening, sir," Daniel said calmly but firmly. "Mind telling me what you're doing out here this late?" The man hesitated, swallowing hard. Just taking a break. My kid's asleep in the back." Daniel angled his flashlight toward the rear seat, heart thudding. Wrapped in a thin blanket was an infant, no older than 6 months. The baby's face was pale, lips parted slightly. He didn't move, not even a twitch. Max barked sharply, breaking the silence, posture stiffening. The growl in his throat now sounded urgent. "I'm going to need to see some ID," Daniel said, eyes never leaving the man's trembling hands. The man fumbled through his glove compartment, finally producing a worn-out license. Daniel scanned it quickly. Name, address, something about it didn't sit right. Every instinct in him screamed this wasn't just a tired father taking a break. Daniel's tone sharpened just slightly. "What's your child's name?" he asked, keeping his flashlight angled toward the infant, who still hadn't moved. The man blinked rapidly. Josh." "Yeah, Joshua." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Middle name?" The man hesitated too long. I think it's Michael?" "Think?" Daniel's years on the force had taught him when someone was lying, and every signal this man gave off was screaming trouble. Max barked again, louder this time, then stepped forward, his body now blocking the front driver's door. His focus remained locked on the baby, as if he knew something Daniel didn't. Daniel leaned in slightly. "Step out of the vehicle." "No need for that, officer." Now." The man's hand twitched toward the door handle. "Don't." But the command came too late. The door burst open, and the man bolted into the darkness. Daniel reacted immediately. "Max, go." The German shepherd launched forward in a blur of motion, his powerful form disappearing down the sidewalk behind the suspect. Daniel chased after them, adrenaline pumping, flashlight beam darting between parked cars. The chase was on, and something told Daniel this man wasn't just running from the law. The suspect sprinted down the shadowy sidewalk, his footsteps echoing against the darkened buildings of the quiet Indianapolis street. Max tore after him, a blur of black and tan muscle, his paws pounding the pavement with deadly precision. Officer Daniel Brooks followed close behind, heart racing, flashlight bouncing in his hand as he dodged trash bins and weaved between parked cars. The man ducked into a narrow alleyway, slipping past a chain-link fence and sending a stack of crates crashing behind him in a desperate attempt to slow his pursuers. It didn't work. Max leaped the debris without hesitation, his growl growing louder as he closed the gap. Daniel caught up just in time to see Max launch forward, his body coiling midair before clamping down expertly on the man's arm. The suspect cried out in pain as Max brought him crashing to the ground. Daniel reached them seconds later, shouting, "Stay down!" as he grabbed the man's free wrist and locked it in handcuffs. The man didn't fight. He just lay there, chest heaving, face pressed to the cold pavement. Fear and panic had finally caught up to him. Breathing heavily, Daniel glanced at Max, who stood over the man protectively, growl still rumbling in his throat. The K9's eyes flicked toward Daniel, as if asking, "Now what?" Daniel gave Max a brief nod and gently patted his side. "Good job, partner." Max released his grip but stayed alert, standing over the subdued man like a silent sentinel. Daniel crouched down, pulling the suspect up just enough to get a clear look at his face. "Who is that baby?" he demanded. The man hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like he was still deciding whether to lie again. Then, finally, his shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. I took him," he muttered, barely above a whisper. "I took the baby." Daniel's pulse spiked. He grabbed his radio immediately. "Dispatch, I have a confirmed abduction. Suspect in custody. Infant on scene, possibly in medical distress. Requesting EMS and backup immediately, corner of Waverly and 10th. As the dispatcher acknowledged, Daniel turned his gaze back toward the parked SUV. From this distance, he could still see the small form of the baby through the windshield, unmoving beneath the blanket. Max stood by his side again, eyes locked on the vehicle, a low whimper escaping him. Whatever had just happened, they were only at the beginning. The child's condition was unknown. The motive behind the abduction was unclear. But one thing was certain: time was critical. Paramedics arrived within minutes, the red and white strobe of their lights painting streaks across the asphalt. Daniel led them straight to the SUV. 6-month-old male, unresponsive, unknown medical condition, he briefed quickly. As the EMTs opened the back door and leaned in, Max stood just beside them, his nose nearly touching the edge of the seat, tail still and low, ears pinned back with tension. One of the paramedics gently pulled back the thin blanket. The baby was pale, almost gray, with shallow, irregular breaths. "Severe dehydration, possibly a fever," one of them said grimly. "He's in trouble." They began moving fast, oxygen mask, for prep, soft voices giving orders with practiced urgency. Daniel stood back just enough to give them space, but his eyes never left the child. He felt a knot twisting in his chest. This wasn't just another case. There was something about the way Max had reacted. So locked in, so unsettled. It shook him more than he liked to admit. "We need to move," a paramedic said. "We'll transport to St. Vincent's. You riding with us?" Daniel looked at Max. The dog hadn't moved from his position, eyes locked on the baby. Daniel nodded. "Max is coming with him. He won't take his eyes off that kid." The paramedics exchanged quick glances, then nodded. "Fine." Just keep him calm. Max leapt into the ambulance as soon as the back doors opened, positioning himself at the head of the stretcher where the baby lay swaddled and hooked to machines. He didn't bark, didn't whine. He simply stood there, silent and vigilant, as the medics worked around him. Daniel followed in his patrol car, sirens off but lights spinning, heart hammering with each passing second. Inside the ambulance, every bump and turn was accompanied by beeping monitors and hushed instructions. Max never flinched. He seemed to absorb the tension, muscles taut but controlled, as if he understood that the smallest sound could disrupt the fragile balance of the child's breathing. By the time they reached St. Vincent's ER entrance, hospital staff were already waiting. Daniel pulled in behind them and jogged to the ambulance doors. Max jumped out first and waited by the stretcher as they wheeled the baby inside. A nurse glanced down at the K9 with surprise, but no one tried to stop him. Daniel followed close behind, giving the intake nurse all the information he had. Suspect's name, incident location, the baby's condition. He glanced back at Max, who now stood just outside the trauma room door, his eyes locked on the small form disappearing behind it. The trauma room doors swung closed behind the medical team as they rushed the infant inside. Max remained rooted just outside the entrance, his body tense, head slightly lowered, eyes fixed on the last spot where he had seen the child. He didn't pace, didn't bark. He simply waited, every muscle still except for the faint flick of his tail every few seconds, like a metronome keeping time with the machines inside. Daniel stood a few feet away, arms crossed tightly over his chest. He'd been in this hospital more times than he could count. Gunshot victims, overdose cases, domestic violence, but this felt different. The silence from Max told him more than any words could. This wasn't just about duty for the dog. It was personal now. Nurses and orderlies passed by, some casting curious glances at the K9 that refused to budge. One nurse, a petite woman in scrubs with Maria L. stitched over her chest pocket, stopped briefly beside Daniel. "That your dog?" she asked gently, nodding toward Max. "Partner," Daniel replied. "He's incredible," she said, her voice lowering as she watched Max with awe. "Most dogs wouldn't sit still like that." Daniel gave a small nod. "Max doesn't move unless there's a reason. And right now, that baby is his reason." Maria offered a small, thoughtful smile before disappearing down the hallway. Daniel stayed beside Max, crouching down to his level. He placed a steady hand on the dog's back, feeling the tension beneath the fur. "He's fighting," Daniel murmured. "And so are they. We've done all we can for now." Max didn't respond, but the slow movement of his tail showed he was listening. Minutes stretched into an hour. Doctors moved in and out of the trauma room. Each time the door opened, Max perked up, eyes scanning every face, searching for a signal. Anything to tell him the baby was okay. Finally, Maria returned, stepping out of the trauma room with a clipboard in hand and a look that was less tense than before. She approached quietly, kneeling beside Max. "He's stable," she said softly, more to Max than to Daniel. "Still critical, but we've got his vitals back up. He's strong." Max let out a soft whine, tail thumping once against the linoleum. Daniel exhaled slowly, a weight lifting from his chest. He looked at Maria, gratitude flickering behind his tired eyes. "We'll keep him in pediatric ICU," she continued. "You can stay close. I think he'd want that." Daniel nodded. "We're not going anywhere." Time moved differently in the hallway outside the trauma room. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like hours. Max hadn't shifted from his spot. His eyes, normally full of alert readiness, now held something more: concern. His ears twitched with every sound, every monitor beep that escaped the room behind the swinging doors. Anyone walking past could sense it. This wasn't just a trained response. It was something deeper. Nurse Maria returned with a cup of water and handed it to Officer Brooks, her eyes drifting back to Max. "He hasn't moved an inch," she said softly. "Nope," Daniel replied, taking a slow sip. "He's waiting, just like me." They both fell silent, watching the K9 in reverent quiet. A doctor appeared briefly through the trauma room doors, giving a quick thumbs up to Maria. No words, but it was enough to ease the tension slightly. Daniel let out a quiet breath. Max's tail tapped once against the tile. "He gets like this around kids," Daniel murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "Always has. It's like he knows they're fragile." Maria knelt beside Max, not touching him but close enough to speak gently. "You're doing good, buddy. He's in good hands now." Max didn't blink, didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on the door, his posture still as stone. He wasn't going anywhere. Daniel crouched beside his partner, resting a steady hand on Max's back. "Hang in there, pal," he whispered. "He's fighting, just like you did." Max let out a low huff, almost like a sigh, but his gaze didn't budge. Nurses continued to pass by, some offering quiet smiles or soft pats on Max's side. One even knelt to offer him a bowl of water, which he sniffed but ignored. His focus never wavered. He wasn't here for himself. The trauma room doors creaked open again, and this time, a nurse stepped out. Daniel and Max both looked up at once. The nurse pulled down her surgical mask, her face still drawn from the tension of the moment, but her voice carried hope. "He's stabilized. His fever is coming down. We've got him on fluids and oxygen. He's not out of the woods, but it's a good sign." Daniel nodded, relief softening his shoulders. Max stood, stretching slightly, his tail giving a slow, deliberate wag. He stepped toward the door, ears perked. The nurse smiled. "He's been waiting, hasn't he?" Daniel watched Max, feeling a deep sense of respect and awe. "He's not just waiting," he said quietly. "He's guarding." As Max resumed his silent post by the trauma room, Daniel knew this night wasn't over yet, but they were one step closer to saving a life. Inside the trauma room, the air was thick with urgency. Monitors beeped rhythmically, for bags dripped steadily, and a team of doctors and nurses moved like clockwork around the infant's small, fragile body. The baby's skin was still pale, his breath shallow, chest rising and falling in soft, uneven patterns. The lead physician called out vitals while a nurse adjusted the oxygen tube and another prepared antibiotics. Outside, Max remained planted by the door, his ears rotating slightly as he tracked every sound from within. He could hear the stress in the voices, the clipped commands, the sudden silences between updates. Though he couldn't understand the words, he sensed their meaning. He felt the stakes. Daniel stood by the window, arms crossed, jaw tight. The longer he watched Max's unmoving posture, the more he understood. This was more than a call. This was a fight for life, and Max had taken that fight personally. A nurse stepped out briefly for supplies, pausing to look at Max. "Still hasn't moved," she whispered to Daniel. "No," Daniel said quietly, eyes still fixed ahead. "And he won't. Not until he knows that kid's safe." Back inside, the doctor glanced at the monitors. "We're getting response," he said. "BP's climbing. Fever's dipping slightly." It wasn't over, but hope had entered the room. And outside the door, Max felt it. Max shifted ever so slightly, just enough to sit up straighter. His ears now pointed with a renewed sharpness. His eyes remained locked on the trauma room door, but there was a subtle change in his demeanor. He could sense it. Something inside had shifted. Daniel took a few steps closer and knelt beside him. "You feel that, don't you?" he murmured. "He's fighting. And maybe, just maybe, he's gonna pull through." Hours dragged by in slow motion. Nurses moved in and out with updates, each one slightly more promising than the last. The baby's fever had begun to break. His breathing was more regular, and his color had started to return. Every time the door opened, Max would perk up, searching each face for reassurance. His tail would thump gently whenever someone gave a nod or soft smile. By dawn, the baby was still in critical condition but had stabilized enough to be transferred to the pediatric ICU. As the gurney rolled past, Max followed silently, his pace steady and protective. A nurse looked down at him, then back to Daniel. "You think he knows?" Daniel gave a tired smile. "I think he knew before any of us did." Max trailed behind the medical team, still guarding, still alert. The worst might not be over, but the night had been a turning point, and Max had felt every second of it. By mid-morning, the hospital had settled into a quiet rhythm. The baby, now resting in the pediatric ICU, was connected to a series of machines that beeped steadily, reassuringly. His breathing was more stable, the flush of life slowly returning to his tiny cheeks. Nurses moved with calm efficiency, adjusting monitors and whispering updates. For the first time in hours, there was space to breathe. Max sat just outside the glass partition, his gaze fixed unwaveringly on the child. He had refused to leave his post, ignoring offers of food, water, and rest. His presence had become a quiet constant, so much so that the ICU staff had started referring to him as the Guardian. Officer Daniel Brooks had finally taken a seat nearby, exhausted but alert. He watched Max for a while, then glanced through the glass at the infant. "You did good, buddy," he said softly. "You kept him safe." Maria, the nurse from earlier, appeared beside him with a clipboard in hand. "Vitals are steady. He's still on antibiotics, but he's responding better than we hoped." Daniel let out a slow breath, the weight on his chest easing just slightly. "And no ID yet?" "None," she replied, her expression tight. "But the social worker's here. They'll start the missing child search now." Daniel nodded. It wasn't over yet, but at least now, they had a name to find and a family to bring back together. As Daniel stood and stretched his stiff legs, he glanced back at Max, who still hadn't moved more than a few inches. The German shepherd's eyes remained locked on the crib, his ears twitching at every new sound. Daniel knelt beside him and gave him a slow stroke down his back. "You'll rest when he does, huh?" he said quietly. Maria smiled as she watched them. "I've never seen anything like it. He's not just watching. He's waiting." Daniel gave a faint nod. Max doesn't forget the vulnerable ones. Meanwhile, the hospital's social worker had begun making calls, using the baby's physical description and medical records to check against local missing children reports. Within the hour, a match came through. Noah Bennett, 6 months old, abducted 4 days earlier during a carjacking outside a suburban grocery store just 10 miles from where he'd been found. Daniel's heart skipped. "Get me an address," he said, grabbing his phone. "I need to notify the family, personally." He turned toward Max, who had finally stood, tail lifting just slightly as if sensing the shift in momentum. "You hear that, partner?" Daniel said with a quiet grin. "We found his name. Now let's go find his parents." Officer Daniel Brooks stood just outside the pediatric ICU, phone pressed to his ear as he listened to the dispatcher confirm the address of the Bennett family. The moment he hung up, he turned to Max, who stood beside him, alert as ever. "Let's bring this full circle," Daniel murmured. The neighborhood was quiet when Daniel pulled into the cul-de-sac of a modest home in the suburbs. It was early afternoon, and the sky had turned a gentle gray, the clouds casting a soft light over the front lawn. Max jumped out of the cruiser and waited by the walkway, ears perked, nose twitching as if he could already sense the emotional weight of what was to come. Daniel approached the front door and rang the bell. It opened within seconds. A woman in her late 20s stood there, her eyes red-rimmed and hollowed by days of sleepless worry. Behind her, a man stood frozen, gripping the edge of the hallway wall. The moment Daniel showed his badge, the mother's voice cracked. Is it our son?" Daniel nodded slowly. "We believe so. We need you to come with us to St. Vincent's. He's safe. He's been through a lot. But he's alive." Tears flooded her eyes, and she clutched her hands over her mouth. The father blinked rapidly, trying to process what he'd just heard. Hope was returning, fragile but real. The drive back to the hospital was filled with tense silence, broken only by the mother's quiet sobs and the father's unsteady breathing. Max rode in the back with them, his presence strangely comforting, as if his steady gaze offered a promise that this nightmare was finally ending. Neither parent asked many questions. They were too afraid of the answers, too stunned by the sudden possibility of reunion. When they arrived at St. Vincent's, Daniel led them through the main entrance, Max walking calmly by their side. Nurses recognized the dog immediately and stepped aside without hesitation. Maria met them in the hallway outside the ICU, her face softening when she saw the couple. "This way," she said gently. As the mother and father approached the glass-walled ICU room, they stopped cold. There, in the hospital crib, lay their son. Smaller than they remembered, paler but unmistakably him. The machines beeped steadily, his tiny chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. The mother let out a sob and rushed forward, hands trembling against the glass. "Noah!" The father followed, tears brimming in his eyes. Daniel stepped back, giving them space, while Max sat just behind them, ears flicking forward, watching everything. The room was quiet except for one thing: the sound of healing beginning. Inside the softly lit ICU room, the atmosphere shifted as Noah's parents stepped in. Rachel, the mother, moved first, tentatively, as if afraid the vision before her might vanish if she moved too fast. She approached the crib and reached for her son's tiny hand, tears streaming down her face. "My baby," she whispered, her voice trembling with joy and disbelief. "My sweet boy." Kyle, the father, followed, placing a hand gently on Rachel's shoulder. His eyes were locked on Noah, overwhelmed by the sight of the child they had feared lost forever. He leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to his son's forehead, unable to speak through the lump in his throat. Behind them, Max remained in the doorway, standing tall and silent, like a sentinel who had fulfilled his mission. The tension in his body slowly faded as he watched the family come together. His tail gave a slow, steady wag. Rachel turned, noticing Max for the first time. She knelt down, her eyes still glistening with tears, and reached out to him. "You stayed with him," she said softly. "You kept him safe." Max lowered his head slightly, allowing her hand to touch his fur. It was a simple moment, but in that brief connection, the depth of gratitude passed between them without a word spoken. Daniel stood quietly near the entrance, watching the scene unfold. His chest tightened with emotion as he took in the sight of Rachel gently stroking Max's head, Kyle holding their baby's hand, and Noah, still fragile, but safe, alive, and surrounded by love. For a long moment no one spoke. Time seemed to pause, as if the hospital walls themselves understood the weight of what was being restored inside this room. Finally, Kyle turned to Daniel, his voice rough with emotion. "We thought we'd never see him again. I don't have the words to thank you, or him." Daniel shook his head, his eyes drifting to Max. "It wasn't just me," he said softly. "He never left Noah's side. Not once." Max let out a soft huff, then slowly sat down near the foot of the crib, his eyes still trained on the baby. The nurses observed quietly, many of them moved to tears. Maria wiped her eyes with her sleeve, smiling through the emotion. "That dog," she whispered. "He's something else." As the family continued their quiet reunion, Max remained watchful. But now there was peace in his posture. The worst had passed. The child he had guarded so fiercely was finally back where he belonged. Later that evening, as the hospital settled into a calmer rhythm, Daniel found himself sitting on a bench outside the pediatric unit. The cool night breeze had returned, and the faint sounds of distant traffic hummed beyond the glass doors. Max sat beside him, his body relaxed for the first time in over 24 hours. Inside the unit, Noah slept peacefully, his parents never more than a few feet from his crib. A nurse had brought in a reclining chair for Rachel and extra blankets for Kyle. The small family clung to one another with quiet intensity. No more words needed, just the soft reassurance of being whole again. The door behind Daniel opened, and Kyle stepped out, his expression tired but deeply grateful. He approached slowly and offered Daniel a handshake that turned into a firm, heartfelt grip. "You gave us our son back," he said. "I don't know how we'll ever thank you enough." Daniel shook his head. "You don't need to thank me." Kyle crouched down and looked at Max. "But I do need to thank him." Max raised his head, eyes calm and steady. Kyle reached out and gently scratched behind his ears. "You didn't let him be alone. You fought for him. We'll never forget that." Daniel watched the exchange, his chest tightening with quiet pride. Max had done more than his duty, he had changed lives. Kyle remained kneeling for a moment longer, his hand resting on Max's shoulder, as if trying to convey in touch what words couldn't quite capture. When he finally stood, there was a new light in his eyes. Exhausted, yes, but filled with a hope that hadn't been there before. Rachel soon joined them outside, cradling a warm cup of coffee, her arms still visibly trembling from the emotional weight of the day. She looked at Max, then at Daniel. "I've seen a lot of stories on the news about hero dogs," she said softly, "but nothing ever felt real until now. He didn't just save Noah. He protected him when no one else could." Daniel nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in his throat. He's always had a sense for the ones who need him most. The door to the pediatric wing opened again, and Maria stepped out, clipboard in hand. She smiled when she saw the group, then knelt next to Max, giving him a gentle scratch. "He's going to be okay," she said quietly. "Vitals are stable. He's resting easy." Max wagged his tail slowly in response, as if finally accepting that the battle was over. Daniel looked toward the sky, its stars faint behind the hospital's glow. "You did good, partner," he murmured, and Max, ever faithful, settled beside him, silent, steady, and ready for whatever came next. The next morning, soft sunlight filtered through the hospital windows, casting a golden hue across the hallway outside the pediatric ICU. The storm of the previous night had passed, literally and figuratively. Inside Noah's room, machines still hummed and beeped, but his breathing was steady, his color much improved. Rachel sat by the crib, gently humming an old lullaby, while Kyle spoke quietly with a nurse about Noah's recovery plan. There was still a road ahead, but their son was alive. He had a chance now. Outside, Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the hospital entrance with Max by his side. The K-9 looked calm, his stance relaxed, but his eyes remained as focused as ever, watching, listening, absorbing the world. A few hospital staff stopped to pat his head or offer a quiet thank you, and Max accepted each gesture with quiet grace. Captain Harold Green, Daniel's commanding officer, pulled into the hospital lot and stepped out, walking over with a look of deep respect. "Heard the full story," he said. "You two pulled off something special last night." Daniel shrugged slightly. "Max did the hard part." Green smiled, crouching down beside the dog. "Some officers wear badges. Some wear fur. This one, he wears heart." Max wagged his tail, just once, acknowledging the praise in his own quiet way. Green stood again. "City Council wants to recognize Max at next week's meeting. Medal of Service. Thought you should know." Daniel glanced down at his partner. "He doesn't need a medal. Just knowing that kid's okay? That's enough for him." Green nodded, his voice softening. "Still, people should know what he did. What you both did." As the captain walked away, Daniel looked down at Max, who sat calmly at his side, ears perked, eyes alert. "You hear that?" he said quietly. "They want to give you a medal. Guess that makes you a hero now." Max gave a soft huff and leaned gently against Daniel's leg. There was no need for ceremony. His loyalty had never been about recognition. Later that afternoon, as Noah's condition continued to improve, Rachel and Kyle stepped outside for a brief moment of air. They found Daniel and Max near the parking lot, sunlight warming the concrete beneath their feet. Rachel knelt beside Max and wrapped her arms gently around him. "Thank you," she whispered into his fur, "for everything." Kyle placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "We'll tell our son about this when he's older. About the dog who never left his side." Daniel looked out over the quiet city skyline, the weight of the past 24 hours finally settling on his shoulders. "Max has always had a way of finding the ones who need him," he said. "He doesn't just protect. He connects." For a long moment no one spoke. The breeze stirred gently, carrying with it the quiet relief of a tragedy averted. As the sun began to set, Daniel and Max returned to the cruiser. Before getting in, Daniel paused, giving his partner one last look. "Let's go home, buddy. Job's done." Max jumped into the car, settling into his seat with a quiet sigh. And as they pulled away from the hospital, the weight of the night gave way to something lighter, something whole. The bond between a child, a family, and one silent guardian would never be forgotten.